Hello, I'm Susan Flory with a shiny new edition of The Big Middle, my podcast changing the conversation about aging in a world fixated on youth. This is where we celebrate our good fortune, smashing stereotypes and shifting attitudes as we go. Changing mouldy mindsets is no small order in a world full of messages that reinforce arbitrary judgments based solely on age. If you're young, you're like this. If you're older, well, this is surely you. No room for individual differences. Nadia Tuma-Weldon joins me from the top tier of the advertising world in New York City. She's the Senior Vice President and Director of a global division at McCann, one of the biggest brand communications outfits around. Welcome, Nadia.
Hi, thank you for having me, Susan.
Now, the name of your division at McCann, it's Truth Central. Curious name choice. Was it chosen before Donald Trump co-opted the term fake news?
Oh, goodness. We run into this question quite a bit in the last 2 years, but I always joke that the name of our unit, Truth Central, sounds somewhat Orwellian, like we're watching the world like Big Brother. But in fact, Truth Central is derived by the ethos of McCann Worldgroup since its inception over 100 years ago. So the real spirit of McCann is based on the line, truth well told. Great communications and great advertising are born out of a well-told truth about the world. And so Truth Central was really born out of truly understanding cultures and the cultural dynamics that drive people's attitudes and behaviors and ways of life. So Truth Central sort of became our name because that's what we're focused on.
Now, I've not invited you on the podcast to hold you accountable for all of the ageist misdeeds of the ad world. You are not crafting adverts yourself. You're the author of a big study done last year called Truth About Age. And before we talk findings, why did you think we needed this truth found and told? And how did you go about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, we really struggled a little bit with this study more than with our other studies that range from cultural forces such as wellness or moms or youth or even globalization. Truth About Age was one of our stickiest studies to explain. And the reason is actually because of stereotypes. When people would ask us, what are you working on? And we would say, well, the Truth About Age is our next study. The response we would always get was, oh, so you're doing an old person study. Well, no, we're studying the concept of age. And so actually what was interesting was we got requests from many of our clients, in the food and beverage space or in the health insurance space that actually wanted a study about seniors to truly understand seniors. And we sort of couldn't ignore it after a while that, we really did have to do this study. But as I started to think about how to craft it and what the vision of the study would be, it occurred to me that thinking only about seniors was incredibly limiting. It really occurred to us that the whole concept of age was being turned on its head in modern culture. So really the ethos behind this study was really twofold. One was to really expand the notion of what aging means. So we're all aging. We all start aging the minute we're born. So to put it into context and say, well, what does aging mean when you're 18? Because you are aging. It's just a different frame. What does aging mean when you're 30, when you're 40, when you're 50 and beyond? So that became a really big question that we wanted to answer. And then the second piece, which I think is really fascinating, is that for a long time, as you said in your introduction, your age sort of defined the way you acted, the way you were, what you preferred to do and consume and think, etc. But now you can really say that age has become a much less reliable indicator of just about everything. So your age no longer dictates your level of health or success or style or aspiration, or even how you think about learning, dating, playing video games, we even found in our study. So those are really the two things that we wanted to investigate beyond the original brief of understanding seniors.
Yes, our chronological age has marked us out through every life stage, and it's just not applicable anymore in 2018. Lifestyle, health, ambition, wealth, too. What impact has your research had on the way you at McCann do things?
I think it goes back to this notion that we're always looking at the truth. In essence, when we are thinking about new communications, new advertising, a lot of our teams come to us, right? And they want to understand the point of view. So it's impacted the way that we work in much of the same way that most of our work impacts our teams. So as you said in your introduction, Truth Central, we don't make any advertising, but we work with all of the teams around the world who are addressing briefs. And again, it goes back to the McCann Worldgroup ethos, which is the truth well told. So what we really try to understand is a brief. So if you have, for instance, a health insurance company that's coming and saying, we want to create a product that targets seniors, right? There's probably a stereotype in the client's mind about what a senior is. And they're ultimately hiring an agency to help them better understand the world. And so that team will work with us, and we will go through the research findings together to build a case, to show a health insurance company or a food and beverage company or a makeup company or a beauty company to say, let us help you paint a better picture of the truth, of what's going on in culture, so that you don't end up creating communications that are just sort of riddled with stereotypes, and that ultimately hold your business back because you're not really speaking to the truths that reflect real people's lives.
Gotcha. Now, do members of your team say that they get a lot of pushback from clients who are really set in their ways? Because, out there in ad land, what we see passing our TVs, what we see in magazines, not much change.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And it's a lot more complicated than I think it appears. I mean, much like anything, right? There's always a story behind the story. So at a very basic level, when we share our work with clients and with companies and brands and leadership, they don't dispute the findings. In fact, I think everyone, particularly with this study, can relate to it, right? Everyone nods their heads and says, yes, my age does not define me. It's a very personal study, this one. So at its simplest form, people absolutely believe it. And the fact is, our research is based on over 30,000 global interviews. And so it's definitely based on what real people have been telling us. So we're not making it up, right? It's actually what the streets are informing us about. But I think what tends to happen sometimes is that it's everything else that sort of hinders the creation of more truthful marketing. So while initially everyone's very excited about really redefining things, I think sometimes protocol and sort of risk aversion and just the way companies are built sometimes get in the way. However, I do think that we've seen some incredible sort of feats of future-facing communications with some of our clients. One of my favorite examples comes out of the beauty space. And I think we can all agree that beauty is one of the categories that really sort of falls on the tropes of stereotypes, right? You see 15-year-olds selling wrinkle cream, and sort of unattainable ideals of what beauty looks like. And one of our oldest clients is L'Oréal Paris. And L'Oréal Paris has been working with older women for a long time. And perhaps the most famous example is Dame Helen Mirren. And some of her work has just been so deeply spot on to it's not your age, and you can live a vibrant, vivacious life that does not veer into a cartoonish life, right? Because sometimes you do see advertisements with older individuals and it's just too much, right? They're, so happy over their mortgage, reinvestment that they got in the mail, like these really sort of ridiculous, almost stock imagery of older individuals.
It's all stock imagery, even most of the ads, it's, gray-haired couple, backs to the camera, looking off into the sunset or mapping out their next cruise. I mean, it just gets so annoying.
It does. And so when I see, what was so magic about the Dame Helen Mirren campaigns with L'Oreal is sort of twofold. So I wasn't privy to the conversations of how they ended up sort of selecting her. She's been a very vocal advocate about sort of embracing your age and living your best life no matter your age. But I would assume on some level, the idea was to reflect more of the population with this, right? So there's certain populations that are aging. Helen Mirren is aging. Let's have someone who sort of represents the L'Oreal values who is that age. There was sort of an unintended happy accident from that strategy. So while, it was wonderful to have this older woman sort of showing us how beautiful you can be with wrinkles, with white hair, and just sort of absolutely sort of, coquettish in a way. What happened was that it actually affected a much younger generation who was unexpectedly very hungry for this type of communication because it made them feel more optimistic about getting older. So
well, some of the studies that we've done here in the UK and other studies that have come out of the United States show that there is a high anxiety among young people about what it means to be older. And advertising, in the main, just reinforces these ideas.
Yeah, and that was a major and really surprising finding from our research. So a major finding for us was that aging is a problem for the young. And that was really shocking to us. What we found in the research was that people, not just women, but men and women in their 20s and 30s are far more anxious, far more concerned about the notion of getting older. And you see it come up in all sorts of behaviors like, they're getting work done, they are trying to dress younger, they are having all of these sort of identity crises about being young. And when we dug into it, we really found that there were some fascinating dynamics driving that anxiety. So the first one was that there's sort of a redefinition of these moments that make you think about your age in a new way, right? So for a long time as advertisers, we would do something called targeting. We would target people at what we might call age milestones, right? So things like getting your first job or getting married or having your baby, that would be a prime moment to sort of target you with some kind of messaging. Now, what we're finding is that those moments, which used to define you sort of moving through life, right? You get married, that means you're older. You have a baby, you're older. Those moments are becoming less defining when it comes to how old you feel than what we found are age moments. And age moments are really fascinating. These are these little nudges that society gives you that make you think about your age differently. And they are far more impactful, far more enduring than any of these sort of traditional milestones like getting married or having a baby. And so with the advent of things like social media, increased sort of advertising that you're seeing every day, those age moments are sort of multiplying. You're constantly being reminded of your age. Why have I not achieved something that so-and-so has on social media? Why don't I look like so-and-so on social media? And so you're seeing that these little nudges are actually increasing, which are causing a lot more anxiety. Another thing we found, which was driving this anxiety, is just a very basic thing that I think affects all humans. And that's the fact that we sort of have trouble projecting. We don't really know what getting older is actually going to be like, and you often hear people anecdotally say like, oh, my 30s are the best. And then they get into their 40s. My 40s couldn't be better. Oh, no, life really begins at 50. And everyone's sort of saying that as they get older, things just get better. But when you're younger, you can't anticipate that. And so, we asked, for instance, lots of true and false questions to people of all ages, just to get a sense of like what people imagine getting older would look like. So things like, all old people are boring, all old people are obsessed with gardening, all old people are conservative. And then we had this question that was, nobody, people over the age of 55 do not have sex. And what you found was that everyone under the age of 40 really agreed with this. They said, of course not. There's no way after 55, you're still engaging in sort of, the great pleasures of life. But when you actually ask people over the age of 40, they all say, well, of course that's false. Of course we continue to live our best lives, after the age that we're talking about. You're seeing that people don't have a good sense of what getting older is like. And part of that is a communications problem.
Absolutely. These ageist stereotypes, we internalize them from a very young age. And so, of course, they march through our lives alongside of us. I noted that in your study, the researchers were asking respondents how old they felt on a scale from 1 to 10. And, not old at all to 10, I feel very old. And the average for people in every single decade from the 30s through the 70s was a 5. Did that surprise you?
Yeah, that did surprise us. We often joke about that piece of data because, we actually ask it sometimes as a quiz question to our audience, so how old do you think everyone feels as they get older? And, the intuitive answer would be that as you get older, you feel older. But what our study reveals that, truly, age really is just a number. You get older, but you never really feel any older. But yet, the sort of culture and society and media sort of conspires to convince us otherwise. We had some really incredible stories from around the world about, I think it does relate to those age moments I was just talking about, those ways that society sort of make you feel a way that you maybe normally wouldn't. So I had the pleasure of actually being in Japan when we did our group discussions. And for those listening who don't know, in Japan, when you turn 75 years old, the government sends you a letter. And it's a letter sort of about a new type of health insurance that you're going to be getting because you've tipped over into a certain age. And we were interviewing 3 Japanese who were in their 70s. And they said to us that they actually did not feel old at all until they got that letter. And when the letter came in the mail, they all said, I got the letter. And I said, oh, okay, I must be old now. But they didn't even feel it and they're 75. So it's these little cues that sort of society give us that we otherwise wouldn't have taken into account.
That's why we have to change all of these ageist messages and the ageism that seeps into our life at every level. Now, you identified in your report 5 attitudinal segments in every culture and every age group. What are these?
This was really an exercise that we did to challenge ourselves, but it ended up being one of the most useful findings that we had. Segmentations exist sort of everywhere, right? Every good marketer has a consumer segmentation. So what they tend to do is companies will take the combination of various factors like attitudes, life stage, geographies, demographics, put them into sort of a statistical pot, boil it out, and then it spits out a couple of different segments that you can then sort of message differently. And every segmentation that we have ever seen, to some extent, if not the majority, are based on age demographics. So I think intuitively we can all get a sense of that, right? There's the millennials, 18 to 34, although I think the millennials are now up to 40 almost. You have empty nesters, 65 plus. You have working moms, 40 to 55, right? So anytime we get a request, there's usually some kind of an age bracket associated with it. And we really use those as a crutch. But if you sort of intuitively take a step back and you say, I want to know everything about people over the age of 65, you kind of think, really? You really want to put all of those people into sort of one bucket and try to understand them all?
Exactly. It's a ridiculous exercise. And it's high time that all of the forms that we all fill out online, and anytime we do anything that involves an exchange of money or some sort of survey, 65 plus, that's the last box on every form. And that simply has to stop. 65 to 75, even if you want to segment it out, do 85 to 95, for heaven's sakes.
Definitely. And in some cultures, like the Philippines, there is no box beyond the age of 40. So we at least have a little bit more wiggle room here in the West. But so we kind of took issue a little bit with these segmentations that were based on age. We're not saying that they need to be thrown out, but we wanted to interrogate them, challenge them a little bit. So we created our own age segmentation on people's attitudes towards getting older, regardless of age. We completely removed age from the equation. And again, just to set it up, I think intuitively, we all know, someone who's 22 and freaks out every time they have a birthday coming up, right? They're, I'm getting so old. And they're sort of an old soul. But we also know people in their 70s or 80s who you would call very youthful, very young soul, right? So you have sort of an age predisposition that sort of carries through you throughout life. So we took, as you say, cross-culture, cross-age, and we created 5 segments of just the attitude towards getting older. There are 3 segments that are incredibly positive about the idea of getting older and for very different reasons. And then there are 2 that are pretty negative about it. And those are negative for different reasons. But what gets really fascinating, Susan, is when you start to filter cultures and you start to filter traditional segments through our new way of thinking. So if you take the empty nester segment, which, by the way, I think is the most depressing name for a segment ever and just has to be changed. But if you take the empty nester, so we define that as over 65 with children who are over the age of 18. And if you think from a marketing perspective, you show them, either sitting on the couch with their grandchildren or, I don't know, skydiving, right? It's always like a real extreme.
Yeah, it's the outlier or the very traditional roles. You are taking care of the grandkids or you're volunteering But you're smiling your way through every day.
Always smiling, right? With perfect teeth. And if we spin our segmentation through the empty nester group, you start to see this constellation of different types of people. And in fact, well over half fall in the incredibly positive about getting older group. And then you get to understand what those nuances are. So how many of those people are really positive about the idea of getting older because they see getting older as this time of limitless personal growth and learning and traveling and sort of enriching your own life.
Well, I noticed in the study that you called these people ageless adventurers.
That's right, because they are ageless. You can be 20 and you can be 80 and you can still fall in that group, but you always see the future as super bright from a very sort of personal enrichment point of view.
And communal caretakers is the next one.
Communal caretakers see getting older as this time of really building their network. And that actually shows up in a lot of really interesting ways. So it's everything from having lots of children and grandchildren and friends to actually spending their retirement years mentoring, to spending time giving back to the community. So these are people who see getting older as this notion of building your network. Again, you can be in your 20s and you can be in your 70s and still feel this way about getting older.
And the third one that's positive was actualizing adults.
I really love this group because it sort of reflects a way of getting older that some people don't always think about right away. But these are people who are really excited to get older because they get to be grown up. So they get to take all these lessons that they've learned through life and apply them and really be an adult and sort of move through the world in a way that's very sort of very self-actualized. But the thing about this group that makes me giggle sometimes is that again, it is cross-generational. And, I think we can all think about someone who's on the older side from an age perspective, who sort of like never grew up and is still kind of trying to figure out how to be an adult. There's sort of, people that I like to call having Peter Pan syndrome.
Yes.
So again, it's sort of capturing what that long view is, no matter what your age is.
And just to finish off, you've got the two that are more on the negative side, future fearers and youth chasers. Tell us about these classifications.
So these are the two segments of people who are, they're quite negative about the idea of getting older. And you have the future fearers, again, thinking about every age. They are, quite frankly, unsure and uncertain about what the future holds. And that can be anything from how they're going to take care of their own health, how they're going to take care of the health of their parents, whether they're going to have enough money, to have a great retirement, etc. So that's all about having an uncertain future. The youth chasers are sort of the opposite of that. So they see getting older as sort of losing their youth and vitality. And I think the really important nuance to this group is that it's not just superficial. It's not, I'm not going to be as attractive or as appealing and I'm going to have wrinkles, but actually it's a lot deeper than that. So the fear is really rooted in not being seen as valuable to society and not being seen as relevant. So you actually see youth chasers really spike in certain countries in North Asia, like China and Korea and Japan, where there's arguably even more premium placed on being young.
In the rich countries of the world, which you operate in as well, you hit your middle 50s, your 60s, and you cannot help but feel you've had a lifetime of being barraged by messages that make you feel you're part of a special needs group almost. It's as if all products heretofore designed to help you cope with your many mental and physical deficits. Age must be defied. Staying as young as possible or presenting as young as possible is a measure of your worth. Is part of the reason for this, the reason that we still see these types of messages in advertising, the lack of older women in the advertising industry?
Oh, that's really interesting. I would say that's probably not the case, just because I think, particularly in my company, we have a lot of leadership who are women. But I think the deeper issue is that sometimes companies are not keeping up as much with the pace of culture. It takes a long time to sort of start to shift things towards what modernity looks like, right? So even if you think about millennials, as I said, we're approaching 40 now, and I feel that companies are still trying to kind of figure out the millennial, whereas there's sort of a new generation starting to come up, the Gen Zers. So I think that, age as a conversation has really been changing most drastically in the last decade. And I think that, quite frankly, sometimes it takes a bit more time to start to change culture within some of these companies to mirror what's happening on the outside.
Do you think it's high time we ditch all the labels? We quit thinking and talking in terms of generations, millennials or boomers or Gen Xers?
Yeah, I think what tends to happen, we've done a lot of work, for instance, around millennials. Of course, we're an ad agency. We absolutely have to understand that very critical generation. But I think the paradox is that the more that we try to unpick them and analyze them and understand them, the more we get into sort of the stereotypes, right? So the interesting thing about millennials, for instance, is that they were sort of seen as like the first generation that was not going to respond to advertising, right? We I think have been blamed for the death of everything from mayonnaise to Thanksgiving, because we're sort of reinterpreting the world following a financial recession. That's just the reality of it, and that's global. What we try to do at Truth Central, for instance, is not add more labels and not add more noise, but actually really simplify things and try to make sense of things that are happening in the world. So, for instance, when we think about that generation born after 1980, who are now starting to get into middle age, there's something to be said about enduring truths versus new information as well. So again, I think because we're a generation that use social media, that knows how to use Snapchat, all of these things, there's sort of this notion that, oh my goodness, how could we possibly understand this generation? They know how to use Snapchat. But actually, people are people are people are people. And oftentimes there's these really enduring truths about young people, for instance, that are always going to be true. And those are things like they want to try to find out who they are. They want to find their people. They want to find their place in the world. Those are the things that will never change. But it's worth understanding what has changed, right? So what are the things we actually do need to understand that's different? And I think the same thing goes for middle age and beyond. There's going to be things that are enduring, right? Things like struggling over what you're going to do in retirement, or if you even want to retire. Those are things that have been going on for generations. But with our new tools, our new cultures, the way that information spreads, and the access to experiences that are now at our disposal, that's going to change the conversation a bit.
Completely. Yeah. The thing is, we see the segmentation doesn't work anymore because we don't have that hard cliff, hard stop of retirement. People are jettisoning retirement, the 60-year career, the 100-year life. Middle age is what, 45 through 75 these days. But it's as if after 50, you're suddenly elderly. You're suddenly defined in the media and in advertising as a senior who needs medical devices, who needs to stop this aging process. So it doesn't seem very enlightened to me at all.
Well, I think that there are things that are starting to happen within culture. Again, it's always a slow burn. And then sometimes you look back and you think, oh, wow, we have come a long way. One of the things that we look a lot at are things like popular culture, right? Because that's where a lot of people form their beliefs about society. So if you look at television shows or movies and how they're sort of starting to redefine things, you are seeing some really interesting expressions in culture. So, back in the day, you might have a show like Everyone Loves Raymond, where you had the, old, grumpy, crotchety parents-in-law, and they were just played into every stereotype of sort of retired in-laws that you could think of. But now you look at what's on and you see shows like Grace and Frankie. This show has Jane Fonda and Lily Tomlin.
Yes, hurrah for that.
Yeah, compare that with the Golden Girls. I mean, you do see that there are conversations and that are reaching a wider audience. So people from my generation love Grace and Frankie. It's not just for the older crowd. And then you even have, movies that are being watched like The Intern, right, which is exactly about redefining retirement, with De Niro and Anne Hathaway. So I think little by little, as that becomes people's reference point, right? I think that starts to change people's minds so that when they do come into contact with someone who's older, they can start to have that empathy. So I think it's a little bit of both. It's what happens in culture and then sort of how people embody that in their day-to-day lives.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I think you've given some really good examples that I maybe was forgetting, not deliberately at all. But, I just broaden it out. You've given some great pop cult examples, but the early hope for many was that the internet would foster more of this intergenerational interaction. But it somehow seems to have created a lot of digital silos as well, of homogenization, much stronger, more toxic perhaps than the analog ones, because it's so noisy and it's so pervasive. You can end up never venturing out of your echo chamber unless you make an effort to find ideas that challenge your views of where you are at whatever life phase. How do you think we could fix this?
That's such an interesting question. I have a little bit of a pushback on that. I do agree, of course, that there is a proliferation of echo chambers, and you sort of construct your digital life to be something that's very comforting to you and very much in agreement with your values. But I will say that sort of the almost utopia of the internet, the idea that you could transcend geographies and politics and demographics, I do believe that is also thriving, because I think that what has been able to happen is people connect via passion points. So if you think about, when you were growing up or when I was growing up, my world was pretty small. I had, 4 or 5 friends that I would talk on the landline on at night. I had maybe 4 or 5 movies that I could go to the local theater and watch. The bands I listened to were either on a CD player or on the radio.
For mixtapes. Didn't we love mixtapes?
Oh, I know. Bring them back.
Yes, absolutely.
So if you think about that, unless you physically were able to travel to another country or another community, your worldview was somewhat limited. But what's happened over the last decade, maybe 2 decades, slowly, is that your world is huge now. You can connect with every piece of music, every movie. You have thousands of choices now to watch every night. You can connect with people all over the world that you never could before. So I think that amidst the sort of chaos of the echo chambers and the sort of polarization of things, there is this sort of shining light that, hey, I'm this kid in a small town in Ohio, and I'm really into, name your thing, sneakers. I'm really a big sneakerhead. And in my town, I don't really know anyone who's like me. Therefore, I am an outcast. That's what it was sort of like for a while. Now, that same kid can go online and be connected with, a 60-something woman in Japan, a 45-year-old mom in France, and a kid in Mexico, and they all love sneakers and they all can bond over that. All of a sudden you feel like you belong. So I do think that those are the communities that need to be nurtured, because if you can connect over something like sneakers or cooking or art or music, then you create empathy, and then all of the rest doesn't matter.
Well, absolutely. And this is why we get back to the point central to your findings, was that we can no longer use age, chronological age, as a reliable indicator of anything. Right. It doesn't define people any longer.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I think in a way, sometimes we played with a term that we live in a post-age world, where you're more defined by your passions, by your experience, and by your aspirations than by your numerical age.
A lot of my focus on the big middle has been anti-ageism. I was reading something from the social gerontologist Jeanette Liardi, Nadia, and she said perhaps the greatest influence on the anti-ageism movement has been the rise of social media, as she put it, a crowdsourced warning system to alert others to ageist products and messages. So another powerful use of the universality of how we're connecting.
Oh, that's such an interesting take on things, a warning system. I guess my personal philosophy, sort of even agnostic of where I work or what I do, is really about positivity and progress and sort of looking to the future. And what has actually been really heartening to me about sort of ageism in the age of social media has been all of the celebration that's been going on. So you look at some examples on social media, I talk a lot about Japan because I've spent quite a bit of time there studying age. And, there's a couple called the Bonpon twins who are a married couple in their 60s who are fashion icons, and they have over 500,000 followers, and people just love them and they're so inspired by them. I think about someone like Mae Musk, who is obviously the mother of Elon Musk, who is just this smoking, vixen.
She's quite something.
She's something, right? And I think that those are actually the small moments of celebration. I'm a big yogi, and there's a very famous 99-year-old yoga teacher that has, hundreds and thousands of followers on social media, because again, it harkens back to that thing about how do we let people have a more realistic and optimistic view of age? So I completely agree that accounts and companies and media agencies that are sort of misconstruing age and sort of promoting ageism should be called out. But I tend to think progress really happens when you can celebrate the really positive stories that people can sort of take into their own lives and repurpose and give them sort of the momentum to move forward in a really positive way.
I like the thinking of Gina Pell. Are you familiar with her? Tech entrepreneur and journalist from the San Francisco Bay Area. Well, she came up a couple of years ago with the term perennials as a way to describe all age groups, a synonym really for humans in general. And she says perennials are ever blooming, relevant people of all ages who know what's happening in the world. They get involved, they stay curious, they mentor others, they're confident, collaborative, global-minded. And I think this is the type of society that we are seeing glimmers of it emerging, because we have a lot of grassroots movements against ageism. But aside from Helen Mirren, we're not seeing a lot of change in the adverts. We're still seeing, the incontinence pads and the cruises and all of this. There still seems to be a bulge of midlife that isn't being marked in the messages that we're seeing.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a lot in there. First of all, I just want to quickly comment on the notion of the perennials, because I think that's really important. And I have heard that term before in the research that we've done. And I think that some of that, it's funny, we talked about millennials earlier. Millennial behavior, millennial values, those are now pervasive across the entire population. We have everyone using Uber, everyone sort of starting to sort of aspire to experiences over things. You have people wanting to pursue passion projects rather than just go to the 9 to 5. So I think perennials is a very modern and relevant term, because I think you're seeing the quote millennial sensibility cropping up across all age groups. So that's sort of the first thing. I think the second thing with regards to the advertising industry is, I think the problem is that there will always be progress being made. Again, I know there's Helen Mirren. There's even, Iris Apfel, who's this 95-year-old style icon, is the face of Kate Spade. So, you see Joan Didion, in advertisements for the luxury clothing brand The Row. So you do see some expressions of it. But I would, just to be fair, say that stereotypes in advertising exist across all ages. And when we did our focus groups around the world, we had intergenerational discussions in 36 countries around the world. And we asked everyone of all ages to bring in advertising that they believe just really missed the mark about their generation. And to be honest, it exists across every age group. So you had people in their 20s bringing in, ads for, ad that they saw on the subway or on billboards that were just as sort of cartoonish about their generation than the older. So I would expand it to say, all generations are sort of changing from a human perspective, but all generations need to be reflected accurately from an advertising perspective.
Yeah. Well, ageism, in my mind, it cuts both ways. It cuts across the spectrum. But just getting back to how older men and older women, I'm thinking 50s, 60s, older men seem to get a much easier ride than women when it comes to middle age and beyond. I mean, older men are presented as wise. Older women are just old and past their prime. Your report points up the need to change this mindset. But have you been able to measure any change within the industry at large, aside from Iris and Helen?
Yeah, just on the point about gender, again, one of our most surprising findings, I would say, out of this research, we did find that by and large, aging is seen as much more of a problem for women. And that's really because of the physicality of things, right? So women tend to age in a way that is not seen as positive, whereas when men start to get wrinkles and gray hair, they become silver foxes.
Yeah, and they look rugged and they're growing into their face and much better than when they were younger. And we really need to figure out a way of showing that the older face, with all of its marks of a life well lived, is a thing of beauty.
But I think the opportunity as well is a lot deeper with men. And I think that conversation is starting to change. So what we found in the course of our research was that while women sort of get the brunt of the sort of ageism as they grow into their 50s and 60s, men actually are the ones that are struggling with it even more. So we found in our research that while women may struggle with the physical symptoms, men struggle with the psychological ones. So we found that story after story of men who, after they sort of do retire or decide not to work their job, really struggle with their sense of self after that. So if you think about it, men tend to place an enormous amount of themselves into their careers, right? They place their sense of self, identity, their social community, their purpose. And when that's sort of swiped from under them, they're left with this very big psychological void. And we heard so many stories from around the world about men who really, really struggled with what to do with themselves. Whereas women, just sort of by nature of being women, we tend to expand sideways as we get older, not literally, but in the sense that we don't just look up and down at our job. We look side to side at our peers, our passions, our hobbies, whether it's a mom group or a yoga group or whatever that might be, so that even if we don't have a career, we have loads of fulfillment. And because of that, one of the most surprising pieces of data that we saw was we asked everybody, are you ever too old to do a wide range of activities? So are you ever too old to go back to school, start a new career, date romantically, start your own business? And what we found was that women were significantly more open to these possibilities than men. So while women sort of get the sort of brunt of the anti-aging, fight aging communication, they're actually the ageless adventurers in many ways. They see that the future is bright, whereas men actually are a lot more pessimistic about those sort of intangible opportunities. So I think it's about changing the narrative to really address the root of what's happening. So you're actually starting to see that conversation with men. So there's a very interesting brand in New York called Hims, Hims, that's starting to sort of playfully make it okay for men to talk about some of the more like mental wellness issues that they're going through, because that just was sort of seen as something that wasn't particularly okay. Another example, which is closer to where you are, Susan, I was listening to Fern Cotton's podcast. She has a wonderful podcast called The Happy Place. And she did an interview recently with the lead singer from the band Take That.
Yes, I've heard it, Gary Barlow.
Yes, Gary Barlow is sort of speaking about his struggles with sort of purpose and sort of mental health. So it's an interesting thing to sort of start to change, almost flip the conversation between genders, right? Like allow men to kind of be more open and emotive about their struggles with getting older, and let women sort of fly and sort of embrace all of the risk-seeking nature that we have intuitively.
Yes, I think that 30 and 40-year-old men embrace this reflection on their well-being and what they're doing. But I think the olders have still internalized a lot of the stereotypes across the generations, and it's harder to shake.
Yes, and that's a lifelong conditioning. It always goes back to empathy and having conversations. And, one of the biggest things that we found also in the research was the power of intergenerational connections. So one of the things that we were really interested in exploring was sort of the future of aging. So how do we age well into the future? And when you look across the globe, you see some pretty interesting nuances that make a lot of sense. So things like, in America, we tend to think that going to the doctor is going to help us age well. We're obsessed with our medical system. But if you go to a place like India, it's more about staying true to your faith, right? So it has nothing to do with your physical body. So you see those sort of different nuances around the world. But we actually found one unifying theme that bound everyone across generations and geographies together, which was the power of intergenerational connections to aging well. And it wasn't just spend time with young people. It was spend time with young people, but spend time with people who are older than you as well, because you'll learn something, you'll age well.
Well, there's a lot of thinking going on about, changing the architecture of the built environment as well, and some of the institutions, getting nurseries and youth clubs to be sitting alongside care homes.
Yes.
I mean, this is happening across the world.
That's right. There are some experimental communities that are starting to come up. But I think, one of the most sort of heartwarming examples was actually just us running this research. So as I said, in 36 countries, our team spoke with everyone from their 20s, 30s, 40s, all the way up to the 70s. And I can't tell you how many times I got a note from Malaysia or Germany or Brazil or wherever it was saying, we never wanted those 70-year-olds to go. We wanted to just keep talking to them. They were so positive and wise and great energy. And, just even the fact that affected the way that we did our own research. It was so clear that spending time with different types of people is really the best way to age healthily.
This is how we can foster the ageless society where we're no longer segmented according to our chronological age.
Exactly.
Have you changed your own thinking about aging since doing your report?
One of the things about Truth Central is when we go into our different research topics, you really put a piece of yourself into the research. And it really sort of becomes a part of you. And with this particular research, I was very heartened to find that I'm an ageless adventurer through and through. So I'm embracing that as I get older, and probably even more positive about it now after doing the research.
Well, I'm right there alongside you.
That's great.
Nadia Tuma-Weldon, Senior Vice President and Director of McCann Truth Central, the thought leadership division of the advertising giant McCann Worldgroup, and author of its report, Truth About Age. Thanks so much for coming on The Big Middle, Nadia.
Thanks, Susan. It was a pleasure.
You can find The Big Middle at susanflory.com and all the socials, of course. Thank you so much for listening, and hope you'll join me for the next one in 2 weeks.